The wind scraped along the clapboard walls of the saloon like a restless ghost, rattling shutters and stirring the thin snow that had fallen through the afternoon. Inside, lamplight bathed the worn floorboards in amber glow, whiskey sloshed in tin cups, and the low hum of cards, laughter, and boots against what gave the room its heartbeat. Men leaned heavy against the bar, their voices thick with drink and dust, eager to forget the barren miles outside the door. Then came the knock. At first it was so faint it blended with the groan of the storm. Only when it came again, quicker, desperate, did a few heads turn toward the door. The hinges whined as the wind pushed it inward, and there in the threshold stood a little figure, hardly more than a shadow. A girl, no more than 8, her thin frame wrapped in a blanket so tattered it hung from her shoulders in ribbons. Her lips were split from cold, her cheeks marked with bruises that purpled against her copper skin. She did not step inside. She only clutched the wood with one small hand and whispered into the smoky air, "They've beaten my mama. She is dying." The room fell to a hush. The laughter stilled. Cards hung in midair. Someone at the bar muttered that she should be sent back to the hills. Another spat into the sawdust, calling her trouble. The barkeep shook his head and drew a rag over a glass, more interested in polish than plea. Men looked away, their shoulders stiff, their gazes heavy with suspicion. The girl swayed in the doorway, as if the weight of her words had stolen her balance. At the far table, a man rose. He was large enough that his chair seemed built for someone smaller. His frame carried the breadth of old battles, his shoulders wrapped in a long coat worn shiny at the seams. His hair was dark, threaded with gray, and his eyes carried the strange stillness of someone who had seen too much. This was a man who once rode under cavalry banners, whose life had been carved by orders shouted into desert wind, yet whose silence now spoke louder than any uniform. He stepped toward the girl, and the floorboards groaned beneath his boots. The saloon keeper narrowed his eyes. "Leave it, stranger," he said, voice hard with warning. "Not your fight." But the giant of a man did not stop. He crouched before the child, the lamplight falling over his weathered face. His voice, when it came, was low and rough, like river stones turning in a current. "Show me." The girl's eyes, wide and dark, filled with something fragile, trust flickering where fear had lived. She reached for his hand. Her fingers were ice. Together they stepped into the night. The door closed behind them with a thud that swallowed the last of the saloon's warmth. Out in the street, snowflakes fell in slow, lonely spirals. The wind cut sharp, carrying scents of pine and smoke from chimneys. Lanterns flickered weakly in the windows as the two figures moved down the rutted track, the child's small steps quick to keep with his long stride. She said little, only tugged his hand now and again, guiding him down a narrow path that broke from the road and fell into shadow. They passed the last of the cabins, where dogs barked behind fences and voices muttered behind shutters. Beyond, the land opened into the quiet breath of the desert, white dusting over mesquite and scrub, the stars breaking through torn clouds. The cowboy knew these paths. His years as a scout had carried him across every ridge and arroyo, though never on a mission like this. Guilt gnawed at him as memories pressed in, villages burned, women weeping, his own hand guiding soldiers to the helpless. Perhaps tonight was a reckoning. The girl slowed near the river, where the banks curved into a hollow of stone. The sound of water whispered beneath ice. She pointed with a trembling hand. There. He followed her gaze. In the dim starlight, he saw the shape of a woman crumpled against the roots of a cottonwood. Her dress was torn, dark with blood at the sleeve and bodice. Long hair spilled across her face, tangled with snow. She stirred weakly, her breath shallow, her body bruised as if the world had beaten her into the ground itself. The girl dropped to her knees beside her, pressing close. "Mama, I found help." The cowboy knelt. He slid his arms beneath the woman with care, and even in her weakness she resisted, pushing faintly against him. Her pride alive, though her body faltered. Her eyes flicked open, black pools sharp with fear, with defiance. For a moment he felt the sting of that gaze, a silent accusation that reminded him of every uniformed rider he once rode with. He did not speak, only tightened his hold so she could feel his strength was steady, not cruel. The girl clung to his coat as he rose, her small body brushing against his leg. Snow swirled around them, catching in his beard, in the folds of his coat. The woman's breath shivered against his chest. She was light in his arms, too light, the weight of hunger and grief more than flesh. He began the walk back, each step sinking deep into the drifts. The river murmured behind, the desert stretched ahead, and the night seemed to close around them with a hush so complete it felt holy. The girl walked at his side, her bare feet quick upon the frozen earth, her face tilted up as though afraid he might vanish. When the lights of the town came into view, a hard silence fell over him. He knew what waited there, stares sharp as knives, whispers that cut deeper than steel. To carry an Apache woman into the heart of that settlement was to brand himself as traitor, fool, or worse. Yet the warmth of her breath against his chest and the fragile weight of the child's hand in his own left no room for turning back. The saloon's glow burned brighter as they neared, and from within came the laughter of men who had turned their eyes away. He walked past without slowing, faces pressed to windows, mouths curled with scorn, but he kept his gaze ahead. Snow crackled beneath his boots, his shadow long against the lantern light. In his arms the woman stirred again, her lips parting as if to speak. A whisper, too faint for him to catch, brushed against his throat. He looked down, and for an instant their eyes met, hers dark with pain, his lined with the heaviness of old sins. Something passed between them in that fleeting glance, something raw and wordless, a recognition of two souls stranded on the same barren road. He did not know if she would live through the night. He did not know if the town would let them. But as he crossed the last stretch toward the lonely cabin at the edge of the settlement, he felt a truth settle upon him like the falling snow. The path he had chosen was no longer his to leave. And inside the stillness of that vow, he realized with a shiver that the story of his life had just shifted, though he could not yet see where it would carry him. The cabin sat against the slope of the ridge, small and rough-hewn, a single room with walls blackened by years of fire smoke. The cowboy pushed the door open with his shoulder, carrying the woman carefully inside. The girl hurried past him to stir the ashes in the hearth, her thin hands coaxing life back into the coals. The flames rose, sending warmth into the chill air, painting the log walls with a trembling glow. He lowered the woman onto the bed he had built from pine boards and buffalo hide. She lay motionless, her breath shallow, her eyelids fluttering against the lamplight. He drew water from the barrel near the door, dampened a cloth, and cleaned the blood from her brow. Each stroke of the cloth revealed the bruises more clearly, angry blotches across her temple and jaw. Her lips were cracked, her wrist swollen where bone pressed awkward beneath the skin. She stirred when he touched her shoulder, murmuring words in her own tongue, sharp syllables that carried both defiance and fear. He did not understand them, but he understood the tone. She had been hurt by hands that looked like his. The girl curled on the rug near the fire, watching him with wide eyes. When the silence stretched too heavy, she whispered, almost apologetic, "She won't thank you. She don't trust no one no more." The cowboy nodded slowly. Trust takes longer than healing bones. Through the night, he worked in steady silence. He bound her arm with splints, washed her wounds with hot water and pine resin, and forced a sip of broth between her lips. Sometimes she fought him, turning her face away, yet the girl coaxed her, voice soft as a lullaby. By dawn, the woman slept, her breath no longer ragged, but deep and steady. When the first light reached across the desert, the cowboy stepped outside. The world was washed pale, the horizon sharp with the jagged teeth of mountains. He leaned against the post, staring toward the town. Already, smoke curled from chimneys, and the faint bell of the smithy rang against the stillness. He knew their eyes would turn on him now, sharp and measuring. Few things stirred more suspicion than a man who chose the side of the despised. By mid-morning, the knock came. It was Doc Harrigan, bent with years, his beard yellowed with tobacco. The old doctor set his satchel down on the table and grunted. "You should have sent for me sooner." He examined the woman with quick, practiced hands, his eyes narrowing at the bruises. "She's been whipped," he said at last. "And not lightly. Town men done this?" The cowboy said nothing. His silence was answer enough. The doctor sighed. "You're fixing yourself a world of trouble. But trouble's been your companion long as I've known you." He left medicine and instructions, then pulled the door closed behind him, leaving the air thick with warning. The days slipped by in slow rhythm. Snow melted into mud, and the woman's strength returned in fragments. She sat up against the wall, her dark hair falling across her shoulders, her eyes fixed on the door whenever she heard voices outside. She spoke little, but when she did, her words were measured, her gaze steady, as though each syllable carried the weight of survival. The girl stayed close to her, yet sometimes wandered outside to gather sticks or fetch water, her small laughter startling against the cabin silence. At night, when the child slept, the cowboy sat by the fire, his hat shadowing his face. He felt her eyes on him from the bed. There was no gratitude in her stare, but neither was there hatred. Something else lingered there, caution, perhaps, or the raw edge of curiosity. Once she asked, her voice low and rough, "Why help me? Your people kill mine." He lifted his gaze from the flames. "I am not proud of what I've been." That was all. No defense, no excuse. She turned away, but the next night she asked if he had family. He shook his head. Just the land and the silence. Again, no more words were needed. Outside their fragile peace, the world sharpened. Whispers rose in town. Clara, the saloon maid, brought bread one evening, slipping it across the threshold with a worried glance. "Folks are talking," she whispered. "They say you've lost your mind. Sheriff says to let her go before it gets ugly." He thanked her with a nod, though his jaw tightened. After she left, the woman watched him, her eyes flickering with something unreadable. Perhaps she had seen too many men turn away when fear pressed close. The girl grew bolder with each passing day. She trailed after him as he chopped wood, asking endless questions, her voice lightening the air. "Do you shoot wolves? Do you ride fast? Did you ever see the ocean?" He answered sparingly, but her curiosity cracked the shell of his silence. Once, she pressed a small stone into his hand, smooth and round, saying it was for luck. He carried it in his pocket, without a word. One evening, when the sky flared with streaks of rose and gold, the woman stepped outside for the first time. She stood with her blanket wrapped around her shoulders, staring at the vastness of the desert. The wind lifted her hair, and for a moment she looked less like a wounded stranger and more like the land itself, untamed, scarred, but unbroken. He watched from the porch, saying nothing. Some silences, he knew, were sacred. But the world did not forgive easily. The next morning, as he returned from the creek with water, he found 3 men waiting near his cabin. Townsfolk, faces hard, hands resting on rifle stocks. The tallest spat into the dirt. "Heard you're harboring one of them. You best send her back to where she belongs." The cowboy set the bucket down. His voice was calm, but it carried weight. "She stays." The men glanced at one another. "Trouble follow," they warned. "You'll regret it." He did not move, and after a tense silence they left, their boots crunching over the frost. Inside, the woman had heard every word. She looked at him as he entered, and this time her eyes softened, just slightly, as though she had glimpsed a piece of his resolve that could be trusted. The girl ran to him, clutching his coat, asking if the men would come back. He laid a hand gently on her head. "Not tonight." The fire crackled, casting long shadows across the cabin walls. The woman lay back, her strength still mending, her gaze fixed on the man who had chosen to defy his own kind for her sake. She spoke at last, her voice quiet, almost trembling. "You risk much." He met her eyes steadily. "Some things are worth the risk." Her breath caught, and she turned away, but not before he saw the faint shimmer of tears. Outside, the desert darkened, stars piercing through the velvet sky. Inside, the fragile thread between them tightened, though none of them spoke of it aloud. The girl slept with her small hand curled around the lucky stone she had given him. The fire dimmed to embers. And as the night deepened, the cowboy understood the truth he had been circling since that first knock at the saloon door. The town was not their only danger. The greater fight would be the one inside themselves, where mistrust and old wounds waited like wolves in the dark. The desert night was restless, stars burning sharp as arrows above the dark ridges. Inside the cabin the fire was low, its glow pulsing against the rough-hewn walls. The girl slept soundly on a pallet near the hearth, her breathing soft, her tiny hand still curled around the smooth stone she had once given him. The woman sat against the far wall, wrapped in her blanket, her eyes reflecting the ember light. She had grown stronger, but the shadow of fear still clung to her posture, the way her shoulders tensed whenever silence pressed too heavy. The cowboy sat near the door, hat in his lap, gaze fixed on the night through the small square window. He could feel something shifting, a weight gathering like thunder on the horizon. When the first knock came, it was not timid. It rattled the thin door and made the girl stir in her sleep. The cowboy rose slowly, his hand brushing the revolver at his hip. He opened the door to find Sheriff Callan standing there, his lantern casting a hard glow across his lined face. Behind him, several townsmen waited, their rifles slung but ready. The sheriff's voice was calm, though weariness dragged at its edges. "It's gone far enough," he said. "Folks are restless. They say you're harboring what don't belong. Best hand her over now, before this turns to fire." The cowboy did not move aside. His voice was steady, quiet but unyielding. "She belongs here as much as any of us." The men behind the sheriff muttered, shifting on their feet. One spat into the dirt, another swore under his breath. The sheriff's jaw tightened. "I don't want blood," he said, "but you're forcing it into my hands." The woman had risen from her bed, leaning against the wall. Her face was pale but proud, her dark eyes unwavering. She spoke then, her words broken but fierce, meant for all to hear. "I will not hide. Not anymore." The sheriff glanced at her, then back at the cowboy. "You see what you're stirring? The town won't forgive it. You'll stand alone." "Then I'll stand alone," the cowboy answered. The silence stretched long, broken only by the crackle of the fire. At last the sheriff lowered his lantern, his shoulders sagging with resignation. "Do what you will," he muttered, "but don't say you weren't warned." He turned, and the men followed, their boots crunching through frost until the sound faded into the distance. Inside, the woman sank back onto the bed, her body trembling with exhaustion, though her chin remained high. The cowboy closed the door, bolting it against the cold. He sat across from her, the firelight drawing deep lines in his face. "You don't have to fight," he said softly. "Not tonight." Her gaze met his, sharp and searching. "All my life has been fight. I don't know how to stop." He lowered his eyes, hands roughened by years of war resting in his lap. "I fought for the wrong side once. Thought I was serving honor, but all I carried home was shame. Maybe this is the first fight that matters." For a long moment they said nothing, only listened to the wind press against the cabin walls. The girl stirred, half waking, and whispered for her mother. The woman moved to her side, laying a gentle hand on her hair. The sight softened the air between them, and when she looked back at him, there was something new in her expression, something quieter than pride, warmer than defiance. Days passed, each one sharper than the last. The town watched with cold eyes. Some children threw stones when the girl came near, though none dared come too close with the cowboy looming nearby. Clara brought food when she could, slipping it through the back window, whispering warnings. "They'll come again," she said. "Next time, they won't leave with words." The cowboy prepared in silence. He stacked wood by the door, filled buckets with water, checked the rifle he had not fired in years. The woman saw all this and said nothing, but her hands grew restless, folding and unfolding the blanket in her lap. At last she asked, "Do you regret it?" "No," he answered without pause. "Not for a moment." Her eyes glistened, though she turned away quickly. She busied herself with the girl, teaching her to grind corn, to braid her hair, to sing the old lullabies of her people. Sometimes her voice broke, but the songs lingered in the cabin like prayers. One evening, as the sun bled crimson across the horizon, The woman stepped outside with him. They stood side by side, the desert stretching endless before them. She spoke softly, her words trembling in the cooling air. "I was a wife once. I thought life ended with his death. I thought all that was left was to protect her until the world finished us too." He looked at her then, his face carved by shadow and fading light. "Maybe life don't end. Maybe it just waits until we're ready to see it again." She met his gaze, and in that stillness something passed between them, fragile, uncertain, but undeniable. It was not the sudden blaze of desire, but the slow warmth of embers, a bond stitched together by quiet courage and shared pain. When darkness fell, the sound of hoofbeats came. Not one horse, but many. The cowboy stepped into the yard, rifle in hand. Torches flickered down the ridge, voices carrying on the wind. The men of the town had returned, no longer content with warnings. The sheriff was among them, but his face was grim, not guiding, but dragged along by the tide. They stopped a dozen paces from a cabin. One of the men shouted, "Last chance. Send her out. This is our land, not hers." The cowboy raised the rifle, his stance firm, though his voice remained calm. "This land ain't yours to claim. Not mine either. It belongs to whoever has the strength to endure it." The woman stepped beside him, her hand brushing his arm. Her blanket slipped from her shoulders, and she stood straight, her face lit by the wavering fire of the torches. "I will not run," she said, her voice carrying clear. "My daughter will not live in fear." The crowd shifted uneasily. The girl appeared in the doorway, clutching the stone in her fist, her eyes wide but unafraid. The sight of her, small and steadfast, unsettled the men more than any weapon. Their mutters faltered, torches wavering. The sheriff raised a hand. "Enough," he said, his voice sharp. "We've done enough harm. Let it rest." A tense silence followed. Slowly, grudgingly, the men began to back away, their anger fraying into shame. The torches dwindled into the night until only darkness and stars remained. The cowboy lowered his rifle. The woman released a breath she had held too long. The girl ran to them, pressing her small hand into his. For the first time, he did not feel the weight of guilt when her skin touched his own. He felt only belonging. Inside the cabin, the fire glowed steady, warm, and alive. They sat together, not speaking, the night holding them close. The fight was not over. He knew prejudice lingered, waiting for its chance. But as he looked at the woman and the child beside him, he felt the strength of something greater than fear. And in the silence, with the desert wind whispering beyond the walls, he realized he was no longer a man carrying shame alone. He was part of a story larger than himself, a story that had only just begun.